Okay, welcome to lesson 9. In this lesson we're going to talk a little bit about summarizing. So we have two main objectives for this lesson. The first objective is to understand summaries. What is a summary? Also, we're going to talk about how do you compose effective summary and what are some of the most effective strategies to use as you're summarizing. So after this lesson, there's an assignment. I want you to read the graph, the Red Book, Chapter 2, The Art of Summarizing. It's probably one of the best chapters in the book. It's pages 30 to 40, and there he gives some really good tips on summarizing that accompany this lesson well. Some of the things he mentions I do cover in here, but he also covers a couple of other things that will add to what I say, so definitely make sure you read that one. In addition, I want you to complete Journal 2. So I want you to also read two articles in Graph. One article is called Don't Blame the Eater. It's by David Zinchenko, who's a famous food critic, and it's on page 391. It's a nice article, relatively short too, but I think you'll like it. And the other article that I want you to read is called What You Eat Is Your Business. That's by Radley Balko, and it's on page 395 in Graph. So read those two articles in Graph. And after you read each and annotate each carefully, I want you to write a complete, accurate summary of each for Journal 2. So that's your Journal 2 assignment is, I want you to summarize Zinchenko's Don't Blame the Eater and summarize Balko's What You Eat Is Your Business. So do both. And then I want you to email me your two summaries to my email, brooks.winchell@go.cambridgecollege.edu, just like you have been with the other two journals and like you did with the essay. So after this journal, I want you to wait for my response, and I'll respond to you as quickly as possible, hopefully within 24 hours or so. I'll give you some feedback on your summaries, and I'll give you a grade, either between 1 and 3. And this one, you know, if you get a 1 or a 2, I do want you to try to redo it. So try to do the best you can with this summary. And some people might get 1 or 2s if you don't quite follow the skills that we talk about in this lesson or that Graph mentions in his book. So definitely pay attention to this lesson, pay attention to the readings, and use those to help you develop your summary well. If you get a 3 or a 4 on that summary, just move on to lesson 10. So without further ado, let's go back to a quick review. So in lesson 7, I introduced you to academic writing, which is writing that engages sources. Then in lesson 8, I discussed the first central skill of academic writing, which is being able to read and annotate effectively. So hopefully you got some out of that lesson and you feel pretty prepared to do some close, careful reading as well as annotating your texts. Careful reading and developing a system of annotation are critical for solid academic writing because in order to engage with a source, you need to understand it well. There's no way you can write academically about a source well without first understanding the source. But after you read and understand your sources well, the second central skill of academic writing is summarizing your sources effectively. Summary. A summary is a condensed statement of the main points of something. So basically, anytime you explain what something is about in your own words, you're summarizing. And we summarize every day, constantly. When someone asks, what happened last night? We give them a summary. When someone says, what did you do at school today? We give them a summary. We consider all of the time and the events that happened, and we sort of triage and think about what were the most important events that happened last night or at school today, and we convey them in our own words. We say, last night was really interesting. I actually watched a video class that covered reading, and it talked about how in order to read well, we need to make sure that we're reading closely, and we also need to make sure that we're annotating our works as we're reading, and we need to develop our own system of annotation. Here's a good example of a summary of what we did last night. Or at school today, I had a firefighter that came in and he talked about fire safety. You need to make sure that you have a plan, and you need to make sure that you stop, drop, and roll if you're on fire. So something like that would just be summarizing. We'd be saying, this is what we did at school, or this is what happened last night. So that's exactly what summarizing is, and summarizing is the heart of academic writing. If I had to pick one skill of academic writing and say this is the most important, I would say it's summarizing. When you think about it, all a research paper is basically just a collection of summaries. So summarizing is super important. If you're writing about one or more sources, you can't and shouldn't assume that your reader is familiar with those sources. It's pretty much a bad idea to assume anything in general, but it's especially a bad idea to assume that your reader is familiar with sources, since in most cases they won't be familiar with those sources, and they'll rely on you to tell them what the source is about. So in your writing, it's critical for you to recount for your readers with a summary the ideas of the sources that you're engaging with. You need to make sure you explain what those sources were about so the reader has an idea. Hopefully that shows you the importance of the summary. Let's begin talking a little bit about the basics of the summary. So summaries serve all different kinds of purposes, and they come in many different forms. There are short summaries, long summaries. If you were to read an academic journal article in the sciences, let's say you were to read an article in the Journal of Pediatrics, probably that article might be anywhere from 5 to 40 pages, and it would probably summarize anywhere from 30 to 100 different articles. And the summaries are usually really, really short. For instance, an author might summarize a 35-page research study by boiling it down to the main point and just saying, Smith et al. 2015, in their article Closing the Door on the Autism Debate, found conclusively that autism is not linked to vaccines. And that's all the author might say about this 35-page article. They're basically just summarizing it to tell us the main point of the finding of the article. So this really brief summary might be part of a much longer review of the connection between autism and vaccine, and the author just wants to give us the gist. This is basically what Smith et al. Has to say about the topic. However, even in this really brief summary, we can see the essential aspects that all summaries need, or the sort of cornerstones of all summaries. All summaries must have the author, who wrote the thing that you're summarizing, the title, and you want to put titles in quotation marks, like how I did here, and the main idea. What's the main idea of the article or piece that you're summarizing? So this right here, even though it's just one sentence, contains all of the essential aspects of a summary. It has the authors, Smith et al. It has the year because it's an APA style, which we'll talk about in 2 lessons. It has the title, Closing the Door on the Autism Debate, and it has the main idea. They found conclusively that autism is not linked to vaccines. So there's a good example of a brief, short summary. But a lot of times you'll want to do longer summaries, especially when your piece of academic writing is engaging more deeply with a single source or with 2 or 3 sources. If that's the case, if you're doing a review of a source or responding to a source, you want your summaries to be much longer and much more detailed. So in addition to the author and title and main idea, a longer summary should go on to detail the major points and key pieces of evidence, or explain what are the major points and key pieces of evidence in that article. So this kind of summary could easily be a few paragraphs to a few pages. However, a good summary should always have 3 qualities. It should be compressed. You want your summary to be much shorter than the original. Otherwise, what's the point in writing the summary? You should just put the original in there. You also want your summary to be accurate. By accurate, I mean the things that you explain in the summary are the things that the author means in the text. And you also want it to be, lastly, you want it to be complete. And complete means that you've captured all of the most essential parts of the essay. If you're missing any major pieces of the essay, your summary is not complete. So make sure your summaries are all 3 of these things: compressed, accurate, and complete. You also want to make sure you use signal phrases. Here's my guy signaling. A signal phrase is when you refer to the author, and a good summary needs to constantly refer to the author who wrote the piece. So you'd say something like this. The author explains this, da-da-da. She goes on to imply that, da-da-da. Furthermore, she argues this, da-da-da. She concludes with this, da-da-da. So whenever we're referencing the author by saying the author or she or he, if it happens to be a he, we're saying this is not my idea, right? This is coming from another place. That's what the signal phrase does. It tells us the ideas that I'm explaining here are not my own, but they belong to a certain author. And that's really essential in academic writing. You need to constantly make it clear where the ideas are coming from. So is this idea coming from this author? Is this idea coming from another author? Or is this idea my own idea? The reader should never be confused about that. Actually, when you do confuse it, if the reader happens to think that somebody else's idea is your own because you didn't tell the reader this came from X and X author, that's actually a form of plagiarism. So you want to be really careful with that. You need to constantly give credit to the sources that you're using in your essay by saying the author explains this, or Smith explains that, or Jones explains this, or she goes on to say that, or he concludes with this. Not only that, but you want to make sure you don't abandon your summaries too early. Whew, don't be like this guy jumping ship. I'm out of here. You want to make sure that you represent an author's ideas completely before moving into your own ideas. In this sense, you want to make sure you suspend your judgment. This is especially important if you have a strong judgment to make. Right? So let's say that you're summarizing an author and you really don't agree with that author. You might be tempted to just summarize the author very briefly and jump into your own opinion and say, this is why I don't like this author, or I really don't agree with the point that this author is making. But it's especially important if you don't agree with an author to make sure that you suspend your judgment and that you give that author a fair say in your summary and represent that author's ideas fairly and accurately before moving into your own opinions. So I always say, don't abandon summaries. Make sure you suspend your judgment. Complete your summaries before moving into any of your own ideas. Lastly, you want to make sure you keep it interesting. So it's really easy for a summary to be boring. Oh, look at how bored this kitty is. I can't believe this summary is still going on. It feels like it's been an eternity. I've just fallen asleep on this keyboard. You don't want your readers to be like this kitty. That's not a good place for your readers to be. You want your readers to be happy and exciting. Keep them excited by varying up your sentences. So in lesson 6, we talked about different sentence types. Remember? Simple, compound, and complex, and also compound complex. One way to keep a summary interesting is by varying your sentences. Don't use sentences that are all the same length, especially sentences that are really short, because that sounds choppy. The author says this. The author then says this. Then the author says this. Short sentences like that sound really choppy, and it's really easy to become this bored kitty when you're listening to things like that. But if you have some longer sentences mixed in with some shorter sentences, and you're varying the way your sentences start, then your summaries can be more lively and more interesting. You also want to, as a general rule, avoid things that sound too listy or too much like lists. Like saying first she says this, second she says this, third she says this, fourth she says that, fifth she says this. So in addition to avoiding lists, be careful with the word says, right? As you can tell from that previous example, it sounds really tedious and repetitive when you constantly use the word says. And I know it's a good word. I'm not saying don't use the word says, but just make sure you use it sparingly. Save it for once in a while. Try to use more active verbs that are more exciting and that are more specific about what an author is actually doing. So Graff gives some really good suggestions in that chapter 3, the one I want you to read after this lesson. On page 39 and 40, he gives a whole list of active verbs that can help you in making summaries. So some of them are argues, right? Asserts, believes, the author extols, affirms, complains, contends, questions, repudiates, implores, urges, warns. So ask yourself, what is it that an author is really doing as you're summarizing, and pick verbs that are more specific to the author's point and focus. That's another way to keep your summaries really interesting. So let's take a quick look at a sample summary. This is a single author summary, and it's written on the exact article that we looked at when we did the reading section. It's on that Andy Worster article, Won't You Be My Friendster? So let me flip over to that. So hopefully you've watched that lesson recently when I covered reading and annotating, and in that lesson I gave you a sample that we read together, and it was called Won't You Be My Friendster by Andy Worster. Remember, it was about social networking, and we said it was sort of like a 6-paragraph essay. She has sort of 3 reasons why she thinks social networking is actually beneficial, but then she also talked about some of the cons of social networking. So this is a good example of a summary of that article. And this is a longer one, so this might be the kind of summary that you would use if you were doing a single author summary response. So if we just overview it real quick, we can see that it's about a page long. Right? And it's 1, 2, 3, 4 paragraphs. So it definitely seems to have a good amount of detail in it, but it's also substantially shorter than the original. So I think this would be a pretty decent length for a summary that you're focusing on a single author summary. So let's read through the summary and see how this author uses some of those things that we talked about. So she starts her summary off like this. In the article Won't You Be My Friendster, written by Andy Worster, 2003, that's APA style, which we'll talk about in 2 lessons, she describes her foray into social networking. She primarily discusses the benefits of social networking, but she also concedes that there are some problems. So this is a really nice way to begin. It's just a 2-sentence paragraph, which can be fine, but she does the most important things for a summary. She mentions the title. So the title of the article is Won't You Be My Friendster? And that article was written by Andy Worster. And in the article, she talks about her experience with social networking. So this author says, she primarily discusses the benefits of social networking, but she also concedes that there are some problems. So I would say that's pretty much the main idea of the article, was that there are some benefits to social networking, but there are also some problems. So she has author title, and main idea right here in her first paragraph. It is a short paragraph, but it's nice setting it off like that just to kind of give it emphasis. From there, the author moves into more detail of the article. So she starts author, title, main idea, and then she moves into the article. Worster begins her essay by describing how all of her friends had joined social networks, but she claims that she was hesitant to join because to her, social networking seemed like a big waste of time. Unlike her friends, she wanted to keep her identity strictly in the real world. However, after some time, Worster was finally persuaded to join, and that is when she realized that the networks have both pros and cons. So here, this little paragraph is describing the 2 paragraphs in the longer article where Worster talks about her resistance to join, but then how she finally gave in and did join. I think the author here captures that part pretty well. I circled a few words. Notice that this author also doesn't use says. She uses describes. She uses claims. She uses realized instead of says. Also, in most of these sentences, we kind of get the idea that this is coming from Worster. She has signal phrases. She says, Worster begins her article by describing, she claims, unlike her friends, she wanted to. However, after some time, Worster was finally persuaded to join. That's when she realized. So she's constantly referencing the author in here with her signal phrases. Actually, every single sentence references the author. You don't really sort of notice it as you're reading. It kind of fades into the background. But you want to make sure you do it pretty frequently. So use your active verbs, use your signal phrases. But this first paragraph captures her resistance pretty well. So then she moves into the next part of the article. This author says, from there, Worster moves into a discussion of the pros. And here, notice how the writer of this summary has a pretty good topic sentence. This paragraph is going to be about the pros that Worster discusses. So it looks like she compressed all 3 of the pros into this one paragraph, which is why this paragraph's a little bit longer, but that's some pretty good compression for the summary. So the writer says, she found that social networking is a great way to get to better know people we see every day. That was her first point, get to better know people we see every day. On social networks, we learn about interests and passions of our coworkers and other people around us. Secondly, and here she does use some transitions to tell us that she's moving into some of the other points. Secondly, Worcester found that social networks do in fact connect us with people we don't know. Remember, that was her second point. So our first point was we get to know people we see every day better. Also, Worcester says they connect us with people we don't know. She describes how she met several new people on a social network through a shared taste in music. Worcester admits that this does not happen for everyone, but she posits that when it does happen, the networks span barriers of time and culture. Thirdly, Worcester found that social networks can help connect people to their communities. She gives the example of how she went to a band's release party and met some people who work locally with disadvantaged children. So in this one paragraph, she is covering all of the pros. So that's pretty good compression. She takes about, I would say, 3 big paragraphs and kind of puts them well into her own words. And she gives a little bit of detail about each of the points that Worcester makes in there. So nice summary here. And again, she uses those really active verbs. One that really stood out was posits, right? She posits that when it does happen, the networks span the barriers of time and culture. From there, the author of this summary moves into the negatives, right? Remember, Worcester sort of ended with the negatives, and this author says, despite the pros, Worcester does describe some of the cons. And here again is a nice topic sentence to the summary. She explains how many people become obsessed with their social networking pages and how people often do not use good judgment in posting pictures. Finally, she claims that young children on the networks may be vulnerable. And those were some of the negatives that Worcester mentioned. It seems like she didn't mention all the negatives that Worcester mentioned, but the author of the summary did sort of mention some of the more important negatives that Worcester brought up. However, all of these cons aside, Worcester sees networking as a great way to connect with people. So this author just kind of ends her summary here, which I think is a good way to end it. There wasn't much in the conclusion, so she just kind of connected the conclusion with the negatives at the end there. And that's the summary of Worcester. So overall, I think this is a pretty good summary. I think she captures all of the essential parts of the essay, so it's complete. I think it's accurate. I think she represents the essay well. And I think it's compressed. It's shorter than the original and ended up being about a page. Finally, she uses her signal phrases really well, and she uses some really good active verbs that keep the summary interesting. Lastly, she doesn't include any of her own opinions in here. Everything is clearly just putting into her words Worcester's ideas with no opinion, so she was able to suspend judgment. So I would say that would be a pretty good example of a summary, and that's the kind of thing I'm going to be looking for in a single author's summary. So let's flip back to the PowerPoint. And let's wrap up summaries. So good summaries are really the cornerstone of academic writing. They're one of the most important parts of academic writing. So before beginning your summaries, you want to make sure that you read and annotate your articles and sources carefully. Make sure you understand them well and you have lots of marks on them. And then when you start writing, you want to keep these steps in mind. Make sure you start with the author and the title and the main idea of the piece. So that should always be the first sentence or the first couple of sentences of your summary. You want to tell the reader right up front what's the main idea and where did it come from. Then, in the rest of your summary, you want to detail the major points. What are some of the major points in the essay? Like how the author of the summary of Worcester talked about the different points she raised on the benefits of social networks and the cons of social networks. It also gives a little bit of a few of her examples in the summary and some of the key evidence that she uses to explain the benefits of social networks and some of the problems. Also, you want to make sure you keep your summary compressed, like how that one was, but also accurate and complete. You want to make sure you use those signal phrases, constantly reference the author, and you want to suspend your judgment of the piece. Lastly, make sure you keep your writing interesting, right? Don't bore the kitty, but keep the kitty awake and excited by using lively verbs and also varying up your sentence types. So the assignment now that I want you to do is before moving on to lesson 10, so before you move on to that next lesson, make sure you read Graph. Chapter 2, it's called The Art of Summarizing, and he gives some pretty good tips in there. Like I said, he has a nice list of active verbs in there. That's on page 30 to 40. Also read 2 articles from Graph. One's called Don't Blame the Eater. It's about 3 or 4 pages by David Zinchenko. It's on 391. And the other one's called What You Eat Is Your Business by Radley Balko, and that's on 395. So read those 2. And then for Journal 2, after you read them and annotate Zinchenko and Balko, I want you to write a complete, accurate summary of each. So use some of the things that we talked about in this video and also the things that Graph talks about in his book, and try to make a really accurate and complete summary of both of those articles. Once you finish your summaries, make sure you email them to me here at brooks.winchell@go.cambridgecollege.edu, and I will get back to you soon, hopefully, within 24 hours or so. I'll give you a grade of 1 to 4. If you get a 3 or a 4, move on. If you get a 1 or a 2, try to redo that summary because you didn't quite get some of the concepts that I mentioned in the video or that Graph talked about in the chapter. So that's it for this lesson. So do your readings and work on your summaries, and get the summaries to me as soon as you can, and I'll get back to you, and then you can move on to lesson 10, and I'll see you there.